How do you feel about Birmingham facing 8.32% cuts, which is just under the maximum imposed on any council in Great Britain?
Well, I think it's disastrous, especially when you take into account that Birmingham has some of the poorest wards in the country, and it reflects obviously the large dependence on the national grant and the fact that this council chose to, in order they could go around the local elections, that we've got such a low council tax, that they didn't do the right thing and actually bring up the council tax to just the national average, which would have meant more revenue, and instead they've chosen the cut line, so that on the one hand it sounds attractive to residents when you're being told, oh, you don't need to increase your council tax, but actually what they're doing is cutting services which affect the most vulnerable in Birmingham, and that part of course they don't publicise too much.
Well, the constituency of Hall Green, which includes your constituency of Sparkbrook, has been told to cut £1.8 million from its budget for this year alone. What effect do you think that will have?
That will have a devastating effect, as I've already said. We've already got some of the poorest communities in England, and also it shows what this government is really about. When they say we're all in it together, just looking at what the Tory Lib Dem coalition here in Birmingham is doing, when an area like Edgbaston is told that they have to cut by just over £400,000, an area like Hall Green, which has areas like Sparkbrook, Sparkhill, the poorer areas, is told £1.8 million of cuts. You can really see what their priorities are, and it does seem they really don't care about what's happening to the poorest, most vulnerable. Perhaps they think, well, the Tory vote isn't there anyway, so it's really about protecting their own areas. And so we're seeing, I believe, an economic apartheid. And I think this will be devastating to community cohesion, and it's no good just pointing fingers at the extremists like the EDL, or indeed the religious extremists from whatever background, whether it's Islamic or whatever. The real threat to community cohesion, I believe, is this economic divide.
And so do you think that the decision on how much to cut from different communities is political?
Oh, I definitely believe that. I don't think it's purely coincidental that the areas where the least cuts are happening happen to be the more affluent areas and happen to be the ones which have Conservative councillors.
So, going to the council, as a councillor yourself, how involved have you been in discussions concerning Sparkbrook? Have the council consulted you on funding cuts, and have they taken your views into consideration?
Well, I think it's always a battle. You know, what tends to happen is even decisions made at constituency level which affect us directly, sometimes there's a manoeuvring to try and take decision making away from the actual area affected, which goes against and is actually contradictory to the whole neighbourhood management agenda, which has been acknowledging that you need to take decision making right down to a neighbourhood level, never mind just a ward level. So we keep seeing this toing and froing. On the one hand, lip service to engaging citizens, which they love to talk about, and yet when it comes to actual decision making, real power, real decisions about where money is being spent, is constantly, I believe, trying to circumvent ordinary people. And as local councillors, we're very much always making sure and in a way demystifying and uncovering what is really happening. So for example, we had a campaign to keep Borsall Heath Library open. We had a very active campaign to keep Friends Institute open, and these were successful, but only because we had to make so much noise about it and have the protests and gather the community around it. Really, the Lib Dems and Conservatives should just simply do the right thing and not take measures which affect and devastate the most vulnerable in our society.
Reading the report to the Director of Constituencies from the 14th of July this year, it really makes disturbing reading. It paints a picture of a lack of investment in existing services, such as the Sparkhill Pool and Fitness Centre, which has been closed for health and safety reasons, corrosion at Hall Green Library, and the King's Heath Library, which recently closed due to the fear that the skylights could collapse due to the weight of snow. Do you feel for some time this area has been underfunded and the council has allowed it to fall into disrepair?
Well, definitely. I mean, these have been issues that local people have campaigned around vociferously, and always there's not enough money, and so it's easier to kind of not invest, never, and not do the repairs. And of course that means that when everything collapses, or when the situation becomes so dangerous, it becomes a public health issue, there's an excuse then just to shut down that whole facility. So we have now a situation where in Sparkhill we've had the bath shop for over 2 years. We were promised that we'd have a new set open by the end of this year, by the end of 2011. There is no way that is now happening. They're going back on commitments they made. And this, of course, will have a huge knock-on effect. We're going to have, for almost 5 years now, no swimming provision, which means hundreds of local school children who would normally have learnt to swim will not. We already have issues around poverty and how that impacts on health. So on the one hand, we tell people, exercise, and yet the leisure facilities which enable that to happen are being shut down. So I believe that this cycle of deprivation will be reinforced because the right priorities and the right investments are not being made. And yet, we have these vanity projects, whether it's a central library or the expansion of the platforms on New Street Station, not even the capacity of the train station going ahead, where hundreds of millions of pounds will be invested in that, and yet local services which benefit thousands of people directly are being told, well, that's just not a priority.
Like you mentioned Project Champion before. I think you said previously it was £3 million to set up, and they're quoting 650,000 to take them all down, all these cameras. Using that funding could have provided some of these facilities that have been closed and fallen into disrepair.
Well, of course. Well, the council will then argue, well, this was a grant that was coming directly from the Home Office, so that money may not have been available for these other projects. But the issue for me is really the institutionalised prejudice. I would have, kind of stepped back from saying that, which underpinned this whole approach. Even when they did the independent review, another police authority came in and looked at what happened, and they were saying there were simple questions which should have been raised right at the beginning. And of course I had raised those questions, but at that time I'd received very disingenuous answers. So for example, we were told that these cameras are simply about crime prevention. Local businesses were told this will help your business. Not at any stage were people told this was simply about monitoring and spying, and that actually nobody would come to assist anybody should they be mugged right in front of one of these cameras. It was simply a totally different type of scheme. And even when I asked, because I've learnt to be a bit cynical, having been a few years into being a councillor, I was not given these direct answers. Right up to the senior council leadership level, Birmingham Safety Partnership representatives, when we asked them to come to our ward alongside senior police officers, continued to peddle what they knew was simply not true in terms of their facts. And that's what I found most disturbing, because it shows contempt not just for people in these areas, but really for the notion of accountability and democracy. Because we do have democratic structures, and there are the right places and platforms to raise these questions in a peaceful manner. And when you keep blocking those off from people, I think you lead to a distrust in democracy, and I think that's the last thing that this country needs. So I was really pleased that although it took more than a year, although we've been shocked by what we found out, but at least that responsibility was taken by West Midlands Police. They acknowledged that mistakes were made, and they acknowledged that these cameras would have to come down. They're still up. We have not been given a deadline for it, but definitely there's a moral victory there. But it's also quite telling that we haven't seen one single resignation when we've had people who are paid huge amounts of money to get things right, to get it so completely wrong, and also to have lied.
One of the arguments the council make is that certain areas of their funding that comes from central government is ring-fenced, and so they can't touch that, and so they have to take money from other areas that aren't ring-fenced. Do you think that the central government should just provide the money up front and allow the council to decide how that money is spent rather than ring-fencing?
Well, I wouldn't want to go down a cul-de-sac. I'm opposed to the idea that these cuts are necessary in the first place. The fact is, we do have enough money to make sure that we don't need cuts. The fact that Vodafone, is not being asked to pay its legitimate dues of over £6 billion in tax because this government just waved it aside, and yet to pay for every university student and not have any fees, never mind a rise, would cost £2 billion. to his country, their priorities are totally wrong. So the ring fencing often occurs for a reason, which means we get a standard of a uniformity across the country. So we don't have the postcode lottery that just because you happen to live in a certain area, you're guaranteed, for example, in education, a certain level. So I think it's right that some areas are ring fenced, but that doesn't mean that it should be at the expense. It's always this false argument. Oh well, it's either this or this. And what I'm saying actually is it's more than possible to have an and that's what we should be fighting for. We shouldn't lower our sights and actually fall for their terms of the debate, because it's what I say to my kids: you're going to go to bed at 8 or half 8. Really, I'm not giving them a choice. So let's not get locked into that. Let's have our heads high and see what really the issues are and fight on our terms and for what's really going to benefit the country as a whole.
Mm.